from the Vietnam War, and this was actually the first battle that really got the United States involved in the war. We had sent troops over into Vietnam, and at that point they were just kind of there with the mission of not really engaging the enemy, but they were dropped. They didn't know they were dropped. They were dropped into the middle of the Vietnamese army. And the battle that took place over the next several days was a determining factor in the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, among which you and your peoples were critically involved with us in that point. But listen to this leader as he takes charge of his troops, as he prepares to go into battle, and then just look at what happens in the event itself as we begin to think about what it means to be a leader. It's rated R for bloodiness, but you won't see that in this clip. This is the trailer. What were some of the things that you caught in that little video trailer that a leader does? Or any leadership traits that you saw?
If he first, he last.
Yeah, wasn't that a powerful line? In other words, I'm not leaving the field. What else?
He's not going to leave anyone behind.
Not going to leave anybody behind. Absolutely. What else did you see? What's that? He has hope, yes. He was painting a picture of, we are going to get out of this. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
He described the enemy as determined.
Yes. He made it clear that this enemy was prepared and that they better be prepared. What else?
He said that hopefully the role of the father or the soldier will make them better together.
Wasn't that an interesting line as well? That it's the total man. It's not just what he's being trained to do. Is that biblical? Yeah, we're going to look at that here in a little bit. What else did you see? When he speaks to them, where are they? What are they doing at that point? when he speaks to his soldiers? Remember, they're all gathered together there. What probably took place before that? Family goodbye, that was what that was, yes. And so there was definitely, this is a serious moment. What took place right before that gathering, though? Massive preparation, basic training. That is the essence of anybody that has been in the military. Any of you ever been in the military? Did you go through basic training? Yeah. Did it end with a ceremony like that? Yes. So there was a ton of preparation that was done before this. What else did you see? Is it just about the leader?
It's all about the individuals as well in their lives and the casualties that they realized they would encounter.
Yeah, in fact, in the trailer, you notice we had the wives, the mothers, the children. We had this entire picture. What else do you see about this? And even grander themes, bigger themes than this. They're going off to what? War. Are we in a war?
Yes.
Yeah, we're in a war. Do we talk about that enough? No. Again, going back to your original comment about a determined enemy. And I think for many of us, we need to be reminded that we are in a spiritual war. And he was very clear about that right up front. Leadership defines the reason why we're together and the purpose for why we're cooperating together. Many of our churches don't have a clue about why we're doing what we're doing. And that's probably because many of us as leaders in the church have not been really clear about why we're doing what we're doing. We are in a spiritual war in this world, and we are taking Christ, the gospel, to the world. But in the middle of that, all the powers of hell are focused against us. And we have to be reminded that Christian leadership, particularly, is kind of the point of the spear. If Satan can take out the leaders in the church, he can defeat the church. And so spiritual leadership is critical to the success of the mission, which is taking the gospel to the world for Jesus Christ. Many of you have shared stories with me about the clarity of which you work with that in the Hmong culture still, with the spiritual warfare being visible. Don't lose that understanding and don't lose that focus, because it helps you be able to lead well when you understand that you are in a spiritual war. So let's look at some of the basic principles of leadership as we begin our process through. When we talk about biblical leadership, it begins not in the pulpit or in the church business meeting, but in discipleship. The same way that going through basic training prepares a soldier to enter into the battle, basic discipleship prepares the church to enter into the battle. And so we often forget that leadership doesn't begin with the call of an individual to a certain job within the church. Leadership begins all the way back to where they're a little kid in preschool and they're going through our Bible study process. They're learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. We're teaching them all along the journey. We're teaching them and preparing them for leadership. Because ultimately, these little ones are going to be the ones that are leading our people on into the future. And so we can't begin thinking about leadership when we're in our 40s. We got to be thinking about leadership and developing leaders when they're 2- and 3-year-olds in our preschool, playing with Legos and little trucks. That's when we have to begin the process of thinking about what it means to be a biblical leader. A biblical leader, our job is to help people move toward or move beyond themselves and onto Jesus' agenda. Just like that commander was taking all of these individuals and bringing them in to the one purpose that was before them, which was to enter into the battle and begin this process in Vietnam, you and I as leaders within the church are to take the people of God unite us and prepare us for the spiritual war in which we are in, to take the gospel to the world with Jesus Christ. We see that very clearly, and we're going to do a lot of scripture over the course of the time together. We see that very clearly here in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 12 through 13, where we're talking about the role particularly of pastors at this point, but this role takes place across the spectrum of leadership within the church as well. The job of pastor is equipping the saints for the work of ministry to build up the body of Christ until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of God's Son, growing into maturity with a stature measured in Christ's fullness. Catch that first word right there. Equipping. Many pastors think their big job is to stand in the pulpit and preach on Sunday morning. And that is preeminently important. I don't mean to undermine that at all. But the more important job is how do we equip the people of God to be able to be on mission with Jesus Christ to impact the spiritual war in which we are in. That is the role of the pastor, and that's the role of leadership within the local church. When we look at what this looks like in kind of a classic definition, Ken Blanchard, who has written the Lead Like Jesus materials, he says this: when all the facts are fairly considered, we may safely say that Jesus Christ is the most effective leader the world has ever known. He was the leader that not only died on the cross for our sins so that we could have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the most important thing that he did. But he also developed 12 men who were prepared to touch the world with the gospel. And so if we want to know what a leader is or how to develop leaders, who should we be looking at? Jesus. Because he very clearly shows us what that looks like in the Gospels as he develops his disciples. When he began with his disciples, these are the simple words that we have repeated a number of times in the Gospels. When Jesus came to his disciples, he simply said to them, "Follow me." He called them to himself, first of all. And this is a very important principle when it comes to understanding what it looks like to be a leader. Being a Christian leader is to be personally involved in the lives of people. You can't do what it takes to develop leaders in rooms of 500 or 1,000 people. You do it the way Jesus did. How many people did Jesus take with him? 12. He lived and walked and talked with 12 people. Now, there were more than that were there, but his inner circle were 12 people that he prepared to be in charge of his movement after his death and after his resurrection and ascension to the Father. So he called out people, first of all, and called them to follow him. Now, the Apostle Paul says something in 1 Corinthians 11 that when I first read this as a teenager, I thought, well, this sounds kind of arrogant. Because Paul says, the answer to Jesus calling out is, he says, "Follow me." And Paul says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." That sounds arrogant, but it's not. It shows the critical factor of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We teach people how to follow Jesus because they're going to look at how we lead. What we say will not be nearly as important as what we do. And so when we are training leaders within our congregation, whether it's little boys and girls in a nursery, or in our young people in our adult Sunday school class, or standing stones, or a national seminar, or preaching to our people, whatever that looks like, we, like Paul, have to live as a clear example. We have to be able to show them what it looks like. Now, if that's true, that puts a lot of pressure on us, doesn't it? We better be living the way that Jesus wants us to live. That's why the New Testament puts so much emphasis on character. Character being critical to understanding what it means to be a leader. Because if the Christian character is not there, the leadership will be off base. And instead of being powerful and empowered by the Spirit of God, it'll be poisonous and deadly to the people of God. I can't tell you how many pastors here in the last couple of years on a national level, pastors of mega churches, we're talking about churches that had attendance of 10,000 or more, fell morally or ethically because they didn't have the character to lead. They were leaders, and they did some good things for a time, but their character flaws ultimately came crashing in and devastated the people that they were leading. Character is critical and important, and we have to live out, like Paul says, the example of Christ has to shine through in who we are as individuals. Now here's the definition of leadership that I want to work with. And Clinton, the guy who sourced on this, is probably the preeminent writer on biblical leadership of the last 25 years. When I did my doctoral project and dissertation, he is the beginning point in which most Christians go to for definitions. And so he says, a leader is a person with God-given capacity and with God-given responsibility to influence a specific group of God's people toward God's purposes for the group. Now notice that we're not just talking about pastors here, and we're not just talking about deacons. We're talking about leaders, because in the church we have many leaders. But see his definition, God-given capacity. God gives leaders. Now we have to help them develop as leaders. There's no doubt about that. But the power for leadership and the gifting for leadership comes from God. And the God-given responsibility to influence. The fact that God has called an individual to a certain task. You know, I pastor a church in Rochester as well, and it's a small church. We're running about 80 on Sunday mornings. When we started off a few years back, we were down to 30. And so we've shown some growth. But within that context, the ability to lead that congregation and to influence them is something that I had to feel like God called me to. And the people of the church had to agree that God had called me to. We have a tendency too often we put warm bodies in place. You know what I'm talking about? I have that problem at Emmanuel right now. Do I have enough workers at Emmanuel? No. What are we doing about that? We're trying to develop the workers within our own church. Because there's always this pressing need for leadership development within the family of God. To a specific group of God's people toward God's purposes for the group. And so when you look at all of those breakout pieces of what it looks like to be a leader in the church, it begins with God-given capacity, with God calling that individual to that, and taking the group of God's people and pressing them toward a purpose. The problem in most of our churches, I think, is this. You might have 100 people, but they have 100 different ideas about why we're doing what we're doing. And a leader has to try to take that and harness it and direct it toward whatever it is that God is calling that church to do. That will never be very far off of the biblical mission, which is what? Make disciples of all nations. Anything else that takes first place other than that becomes a diversion. Pastors, if you need leaders, you've got to develop and deploy them yourselves. That's the biblical example of what we're going to look like at. Now, once in a while, God will give you somebody that somebody else developed. But that's not the norm. The norm is look at the people God has given you and begin to invest in them and raise them up for leadership for the next generation. Because the heart of becoming a leader is developing leaders. Now, chew on that for a second. The heart of becoming a leader is developing leaders. And you can look all the way through the book of Acts and see this. What did Paul do everywhere he went? He developed leaders. You remember what Paul did? It says that he went and appointed leaders in every place. He called them elders. We're going to look at that in a little while. Elders and pastors are basically the same. But he appointed leaders and he developed leaders. Who did Paul develop when we're looking at the writings of Paul? He began to pour his life into young men. Who were those young men? Timothy, Titus. They're ones that are mentioned directly. He was developing the next generation of leaders. A pastor has to be developing the next generation of leaders. And yet, most training, and I have a doctorate degree. I don't ever remember anybody saying that that was my job. And yet, if I'm not developing leaders for the next generation, where will the church be in the next generation? We have to be leading and developing leaders. Now, this may be almost impossible to read on your piece of paper. I don't know. It's pretty small. But here's the piece that I put together a number of years ago to help me understand what this looks like. The development of a Christian leader does not begin with a call or putting them into a position. It begins, first of all, with a lost person that hears the gospel, receives Christ, and begins in the process of discipleship, begins to grow. Then the church helps them understand what their spiritual gifts are. And then they begin serving under a leader. And then they are trained to be a leader. They're released into leadership. And then they are fully engaged follower of Jesus. And so the goal is here. And all across that spectrum is the leadership development process. You understand what I'm saying here? And so there may be leaders in this room today that you're working with people at number 7. You're trying to train people to become a leader, which means you're already released into leadership yourself. And so basically what you have are individuals that are 1 or 2 steps further this direction, helping people that are here on this side make another step, moving them toward leadership, which we call that discipleship. Really, you cannot separate discipleship from leadership. It's on the same continuum, in other words. And you really can't separate discipleship from evangelism because it's over here. This is evangelism, even though this is still leadership development. This is evangelism. This becomes discipleship. Are you following me? And so the critical job of leaders in the body of Christ is trying to help people make it to the next step. 1 step at a time, developing a leader. Moving them a little bit further on the process to becoming a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ, fully engaged in the mission that God calls them to within the church. Any questions about that? This is really critical. Yes?
You know, I'm kind of glad that you put it in that perspective because I noticed not everyone's well educated, so the younger one can get it from outside. But in the old days, I remember where people just sit in number 3.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yes, and we never really had number 4 until I go to that Christian school, and it opened my eye, and it was like, I found this prescription in my eyes that I can see the Bible and I can see God clearly. So I came back and I said, we've got to have discipleship.
Amen.
Yes,
And that's a critical statement. Yes. And I would agree with you. I remember as a kid that every Sunday was just an evangelistic sermon. It never addressed anything else. Now, we did some of this in Sunday school, but not everybody went to Sunday school. And so if you're only coming to worship and every service is on only this, then you never bring them further on the spectrum. And you're absolutely right. It's a good comment.
And they never really give people the opportunity to train potential leaders.
Yes.
That's one thing I learned. But leadership will teach you all that.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I begin very early in this process. One of the things I do is I go in on Sunday morning and I'm praying through things and I'm cleaning up the pews because there's junk all around it. And I make sure that we use 2 candles on the Lord's Supper table every Sunday. And so I check on that. What I try to do is find kids in the congregation to begin to do those things. And so I'll recruit a kid, and I say, would you be willing to make it your job to come in and make sure that the envelopes are in their little pockets and cleaned up every Sunday morning so it's not a mess? So I'm talking about 8, 9-year-old boys and girls at this point. I have a 10-year-old girl who's now responsible for the candles. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal to us at this stage of our life, but I remember being a little boy at school and being in charge of the film projector. Now, that, we don't even have those things anymore. It would be the equivalent to setting up the computer equipment today. And I remember thinking, this is awesome, I got a job. You know, at that age. Those are the kind of things that we have to start doing even with the youngest people in our church. And as they grow older, we've got to continue to do that. Find out what their gifts are, which we're going to talk about a little later. Find ways to plug them in so they can use their gifts. Because people that are not contributing in the body of Christ are people that become bored, and then they give up. They think, but there's nothing really here of any significant importance to my future development. It's our job as leaders to make sure that we help them get to that next step on this progression. How did Jesus make disciples? Now, there's some big words. These are not my words. This is Robert Coleman, the master plan of evangelism. This is probably still, after 30 years, these are the most recognized terms for what Jesus did with his disciples. First of all, he selected them. He chose the 12 individuals. Now, Christian leaders, you need to choose carefully the people that you're going to put your efforts into and you're going to try to develop, because that's exactly what Jesus did. He had hundreds of people that were following him, but he chose the ones that he was going to invest in. He associated with them at that point. He became personally involved in their lives. If you and I are going to lead people, we've got to be personally involved in their lives. It's beyond just attending a class. It means getting to know who their kids are and what they're struggling with in life. It means getting to know them personally and associating with them. It probably means going out and doing some fun stuff with them that's not even church related, like Jesus did with his own disciples. It means spending a lot of time with them. It means consecrating them. At some point, what Jesus did was he challenged them. In Matthew 11, I put this example, take my yoke upon you. At some point, as Jesus was beginning to develop his disciples, and as they were beginning to understand, he basically is saying to them, I've called you to myself. Now take my yoke upon you, my purpose, my plan, and make that kind of commitment to follow me. As a leader, at some point might be a point where we have to formalize a relationship like Jesus did with his disciples and make it clear what the next step looks like. We need to empower them. Now, we don't have the Spirit of God to empower our leaders with, but God gives them that automatically. You and I need to empower them by releasing them and giving them the opportunity. We have to let them fail once in a while. We have to give them just one step further than what they're comfortable with and give them an opportunity at that point. We come alongside of them in this, but we literally have to give them the authority and the power to do whatever it is that they're calling. We demonstrate for them how to do whatever it is that they need to be doing or they're being called to do. We delegate to them. We tell them the individual things that we want to help them develop and become involved in. We supervise them, and then we ask them to go out and reproduce by making leaders just like they've made. So when you look at what Jesus did, is that a pretty amazing story? Again, my point is, if you want to know how to make disciples, because that's the very last thing, you remember the very last thing Jesus says to his disciples is what we call the Great Commission. Go and have dinner parties. Go have Sunday after church meals. Go out and distribute food. Go out. That's not what he said. What did he say? Make disciples. His disciples at that point, they didn't have to wonder what that meant. Don't you think that they stopped and said, oh, he means do exactly what he did with us, with other people. And so if we want to know what it takes to develop leaders or make disciples in the fullest sense, these are the things we need to do. Because those are the things that Jesus did. You following? Any comments about that? When you go back into the Gospels and start looking at what Jesus did with his disciples, think about how that should be applied in your life as a leader. You remember when he sends them out in groups of twos? It is a clear example of how he has prepared them up at this point Now he's going to go out and send them off to do ministry. And when they come back, what does he do? Anybody remember? He says, what happened? And they begin to tell him what they saw. And they saw the power of God released in their lives. It was Jesus making disciples and making leaders in the process. And this is the process that he did again. Any comments? Have any of you seen that kind of stuff even in your own lives and ministry? Doesn't it help a little bit to see it on paper? To be able to, we read the gospel sometimes. We see the details, but we don't see the trends. We don't see what Jesus was overall trying to do with each of these passages of Scripture. Those are the things that we need to do as leaders. Now for us, what we need to think about is who invested in us. Who helped develop us? Because you wouldn't be in this room if you weren't already a leader. You wouldn't be drawn to this if you were not a leader. You'd be going to something else. Who helped get you to this point in your own life? Now, it might not have been as clear as the pieces that we've just talked about because, like I said, most pastors haven't been trained to think of ministry in this way. So it might not be as clear to you who influenced you in your life and who brought you here, but for many of you, I bet it is. You can still think of somebody that influenced you. I remember when I had actually graduated from college before God called me into the ministry. And when I actually went and talked to my pastor and asked him to pray with me about what was going on, you know what he said to me? He said, well, I wondered how long it'd take you to sense this. And then I stopped and thought about it, and I could see that he had been working on me for 10 years, and I didn't understand it. He had put me in charge of teaching 7th and 8th grade boys when I was in high school. And then he had put me in charge of teaching 11th and 12th grade boys and girls when I was in college. In my second year of college, he put me in charge of the personnel committee of the church, which I thought, this is ridiculous. Sophomore in college, being in charge of the personnel, which meant I was overseeing the work of 2 part-time employees and leading a committee to do that. And so when God called me into the ministry, and I sit down in front of him, I suddenly realized he had a clue to this a long time ago. And he had been just gradually working with me along the journey to help prepare me for what that next step was. He did it invisibly, and some of you have probably had a similar experience to that, where you can look back and see that God had done that. We see some of this come out in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. You therefore, my son, and he's talking to Timothy, this is Paul talking to Timothy. You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And so this is that moment where Paul was actually explaining to Timothy what he had been doing in his development of Timothy. You see that? And now he's telling Timothy, go and do exactly what I did with you. Which is exactly what Jesus tells his disciples at the Great Commission. Go and make disciples. And they thought, they didn't have to stop and think, what does that mean? They knew that they had to do exactly what Jesus had done with them. And so when we think about this process, and this is every doctoral project that's ever done is based on this very same thing. How does a leader pour out his life into the life of a certain limited number of people who then are charged to do the same thing with other people? And based upon that scripture, what was happening, Paul was saying to Timothy, find some faithful men and grow them. Take them to the next step. Now, ladies, this doesn't leave you out. It works the same way in your lives and in your ministries as well. Just because the text says faithful men doesn't mean that it doesn't work with women as well. It's the biblical process. Is begin to pour your life out into people. This is how they did it, and how did they do it is working through faithful men, one at a time in those personal relationships. Now, the thing I hope you're thinking right now in your mind, because I hope this isn't just a download, although it is to some degree, but I hope you're thinking in your mind, not only who did this for you, but I hope you're thinking, who are you going to do this for? Because the way this works is, I don't know, 20 people here in the room, maybe a little bit more than that. If 20 people in this room begin to pour into another 20 or even 2 people, 40 people. You see how the leadership base changes? Overnight, you have developing leaders that will begin to impact not only your church, but your community, and begin the process of making disciples. So this is the reproducible process that we have in the Bible of developing leaders. Now, John Maxwell says that your potential leaders have 5 basic needs. So whoever you've identified, in fact, just take a second. Just stop for a second, everybody close their eyes, and ask God. Ask God right now, Lord, are there 2 or 3 people that you've already put in my life that maybe are the people that I need to be developing for the next day? Just stop and just close your eyes, talk to the Lord, and ask. Did he bring anybody to mind? Maybe the people you're already working with.
I want to say, when you were saying, what are you thinking? And when I look at this, like the previous slide, and this is what business-minded people are. It's all about networking. And like we use this process to be successful.
Yes.
If we use the same process which Jesus has already set for us, for Apostle Paul, we can be so successful in reaching to others and building leaders
Yes.
across the board.
And that's a great observation. Ken Blanchard, that I quoted from here just a few slides back, he wrote the book Lead Like Jesus. He wrote that primarily for the business audience. He was the preeminent business instructor in the nation who is also a committed follower of Jesus. And he said, if you look back into the life of Jesus, you find more leadership capability than any person that has ever lived, that he was the greatest leader that had ever lived. And so you're right, these principles will work outside of the church as well. And the business world, unfortunately, has been better at it than we have. Because they're making money off of it, and they know what makes money. We kind of lose the scorecard in the church. We get fuzzed out, and we don't see the end results of this as clearly. Because the scorecard is people, and we don't even capture their total ministries, really. Because we don't know what they said to their co-worker at work on Monday morning that God is using. We don't see all that. Whereas the scorecard at a business is to make more money or make more sales, and it makes more sense. It's more directly and easily followed, I think, than in the church. So, with in mind that individual or 2 or 3 that you had, these are the things that you need to be thinking about as you move them along the perspective of the spectrum itself that we looked at on the arrow. First of all, they need opportunities to succeed. You need to find what is the next step for those individuals and help them make that next hurdle. If it's an 8-year-old boy, it might be what we talked about, taking care of the envelopes at church. If it's a 10-year-old girl, it might be taking care of the candles. If it's a 16-year-old girl, it might mean starting to work in the nursery and be in charge of something like that. If it's a 16-year-old boy, it might be 2 or 3 other things. It might be helping somebody on Wednesday night, like my wife is doing right now, where she's taken the 2 oldest kids in the group that are actually 2 years older than any of the other kids in the group, and she has made them leaders. Now, she did that with an intentionality. First of all, they were likely to get bored because most of the other kids were younger. And so by making them junior leaders, they begin to take on some responsibility within the group. And as she pours out just the next step into their lives, it might mean that they're listening to the other kids, bring the scripture memory work together. They're working with the other kids, taking them off in the room for the recreation time and leading that. But the process is, they don't know it yet, but what she's doing is she's taking that older girl and that older boy and she's making them into the next level of leadership. Because we hope that a certain number of those kids, ultimately, they'll be leading the youth group. And then they'll come back and they'll be in charge of some committee at your church, or some of them might end up being pastors or pastors' wives at some point. But they're all going to find their journey of leadership develop a step at a time. And so we need to give them opportunities to succeed. They need to know that what you expect of them, exactly. I realized when I put this girl in charge of the candles that I didn't tell her where the candles were. You know, so 2 weeks after the first one's burned out, you know, it was like, oh, I called her and told her what I wanted her to do, but I didn't tell her where the candles were. So she couldn't do the job unless I helped her know where the candles were. So we need to know, they need to know what we expect of them, and they need to know how to do it. They need to know how they're doing. You know, if you put somebody in charge of this, you walk in, you tell the 10-year-old boy, you know, hey, it really looked good this morning. I appreciate the fact that you got all those envelopes straightened out. You got the ones that all the little kids doodled on, thrown away, and the pins in the right slot. That may not seem like a whole lot, but you recognize the contribution that person has made. They need to be coached. Because as this process moves further from candlesticks and cards and pews, it gets more complex. And so like at our church where we had Clint Calvert, who was coaching 2 of our teachers on Sunday morning. He was actually using them on Wednesday nights on an occasional basis. They didn't know that he was preparing to ask them to teach Sunday school classes 6 months later. And so he was working with them on Wednesday nights as substitutes for him in preparation for teaching Sunday school ultimately. And all along the way, he's interacting with them and helping them understand that they could have done this, or they might have thought about doing that. They did a really great job at this point. What questions do you have? How do you make the next step? They need somebody pouring into their lives, which is you, and helping them understand what those decisions are. They need to know their contributions are valuable to you and to the team. And this is something that we don't do very well, at least in my churches. I don't know in your churches if you're doing better at this. But we put people into jobs and we never even say thank you. They show up, they show up for a year and they teach a Sunday school class and then they quit, and all of a sudden we got to find somebody else to do it, and we stop and we think, so what went wrong? One thing that might have went wrong was not saying thank you often enough. You know, you take for granted the fact that people are going to work in your nursery week after week and pour their lives into little kids' lives. You know, that's a frantic job. You can romanticize it a little bit and think this is a wonderful thing to get to do. That works for a few weeks. And then you get worn out. And a thank you is a nice thing. It's more valuable than what most of us realize. But they need to know that they're fitting into this mold. I had a lady in our church. Here, go ahead.
As you say, when you give them a chance from A to 5, or 1 to 5, it actually helps them to grow up. And
Absolutely.
they can, when you're not there, they can actually feel your role.
That's right.
I ran into a girl at the New Year, and she came right and hugged me, and she goes, "We love you, we miss you a lot because you left the church, but when you have started us from high school,
Yep.
all the way through, and they have a college degree, and they came back and they become Sunday students."
That's right.
And they said we learn everything, how orientation and the training, and then at the end of the year, you give us pizza. You know, they're young, right? You give us pizza, and you give us like Starbucks and gift cards. She goes, "I take that with me, and it works really well with the new church." So I think that we invested a little bit more than just recruiting them or hand them the book. You know, do let them know that they have accountability when they hold this position.
Yes.
Like you said, if you're in charge of the candle, if I show you where it is, I expect you to replace it,
That's
right?
right.
So when you do that, then they do their role very well. If
That's
you give
right.
them a chance.
Even to the point of letting them fail.
Yes.
Because on the second Sunday, she didn't like the candle. I didn't like the candle. And you know, I never asked her, because I talked to her about it later on, but I never asked her the question. But I know when she sat down and saw that those candles weren't lit for the entire service, she realized that what she was supposed to do didn't get done unless she did it. Now, if I had gone up and lit the candle, then she'd have thought, well, it's no big deal, somebody else will take care of it. And so, yes, all of that. And that's a process of that coaching and that mentoring, and that's exactly what I'm talking about with Clint Calvert. That's what he was doing. When he was gone, they substituted. And so ultimately, the idea is to work yourself out of a job because you've got a new leader to be able to do that, which means then ultimately you can begin working with somebody else as well. Very good. All right, so that brings us through kind of the first section on some basic leadership thought. We got about 10 minutes, and then we'll have been here an hour. So let me go ahead and get us started in this section, and then we'll break at exactly 9:30 so you can go get something to drink and go to the restroom. We'll give you about 10 minutes. Does that sound all right? And then we'll move on. So we're moving now to basically leadership qualifications. And we see that come out in a couple of the clearest places for us is when we're talking about what Paul says about pastors and deacons. Because these leadership qualifications, they are given for pastors and deacons. But honestly, they're perfect qualifications and benchmarks for every leader within the church. So we're going to talk specifically about the roles of pastors and deacons in a little bit, but keep in mind that these things apply to every other level of leadership within the church as well. Now, first of all, as we're beginning to launch into the qualifications for leadership, we need to talk a little bit, I think, about the call of God, because I think we have a tendency to kind of assume the call of God. And we need to understand the call of God, which is clearly brought to us in Scripture, is based upon the movement of God in our lives. When Jesus sees his disciples again, what did he say to them? Follow me. He called them out for a specific purpose. What was that purpose? And I will make you fishers of men. That's basically what making disciples is. Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So he called them out. Now, did God call some of us into ministry roles? In fact, when it comes down to ordaining pastors or deacons, if they can't tell us that God called them to this ministry, I would say that scripturally we don't want to elevate them to that level of leadership. If we have an angry old man in our church who's bitter and kind of nasty, and we need somebody to work in the preschool, do we ask him to serve in the preschool? I wouldn't think so. First of all, he's not gifted for that, which we're going to talk about later, but he certainly isn't called by God. There is a degree in which, particularly in the more important roles in the church, whether it be a pastor or a deacon or a women's ministry leader or our key Sunday school teachers within the church, if there's not some sense of call in their lives toward this role, then we probably ought not push them in that direction. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't experimentally kind of develop them in the process and see if ultimately that might be the place for them to go. But when we put them into a key role, I think they better be called by God in that role. If they are not, they won't be sustained and they won't last. That call of the Lord Jesus to follow me is completely and most important. Now, in the pastoral role, I think that comes out to us like in 1 Corinthians 9:6, where Paul is talking about his call. Remember, he was called to preach to the Gentiles, which is us in this room. He was called to preach to the Gentiles, and Paul expressed it this way. He reached the point where he felt like, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. In other words, I cannot not preach the gospel. I have to preach the gospel. It's like in the Old Testament, fire in my bones. Jeremiah. He couldn't contain it. It had to come out because it came from God himself. That call of God. Charles Spurgeon, who was probably the most famous preacher of the 1800s, and again read just tremendously even to this day. He put it this way: if you can do anything else, do it. If you can stay out of the ministry, stay out of the ministry. That's what he was saying to young men who felt called to be pastors. The call of God ought to be so strong in your life that you cannot not do it. You knew you would be disobedient if you didn't follow the call. That's the kind of strength of the call of God. And there are key roles in the church that are like that. If there is not a calling to it, we ought not try to put people into it, because the end will not be good. We have to recognize, and we're going to talk exclusively a little bit further on how you and I actually work in the lives of people to recognize the call of God and the giftedness of individuals that God has prepared them to serve. That'll be probably in the third session. Has your call been confirmed by the church? Again, we're talking at this point mostly about pastors. But if a young man says, I want to be a preacher, and we see that in 1 Timothy 3, that it can be something that a young person aspires to, and then we begin to investigate in their life their call, and we get the sense of whether that young man is called of the Lord or not, it is preeminently important for the church to confirm that. That's why we have, typically in the past, we had this first step called licensing and a second step called ordination, where the congregation would take a look at that young man and say, he shows evidence of the Spirit of God at work in his life. There's evidence that God's calling him to this. He has a passion for the Word of God and for the people of God. We recognize that perhaps God is calling him to the pastor. And then we begin to develop that individual so that they can be released into that calling. But it comes with a confirmation of the church. Because people get all kinds of crazy ideas about what they feel called to do. I had a young man come, he was a young man that came to me years ago when I was pastoring in Iowa. And he says, I feel like God's calling me to do a hospital ministry. And I thought, wow, that'd be great. I thought, man, I don't know if I see it in you. I do need some help. And so I thought, well, let's see what happens. And so I gave him a person that was in the hospital, and I asked him to go see the individual, and I told him, she's had a heart attack. She seems to be doing fairly fine right now. I set it up. He went up to see the person in the hospital, and she said, that she'd had the heart attack, explained it all out. And he said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. First of all, you don't ever say that. My grandfather had a heart attack similar to that. Now, if you're laying in the hospital bed and somebody tells you that they had exactly the same experience, what is the next question out of your mouth? Yeah, that's the question is, so how'd he do? Well, he died. I decided when he got back to the church that whatever God was calling him to, that was probably not it. So there needs to be some confirmation by the leadership. That's why if you and I are involved in their lives very early and we're seeing them develop along the way, we can help give them the opportunities that are in their areas of giftedness. And that's part of the process. But there's a confirmation that comes by the church. Now, the next step of this, when it comes to pastoral ministry, is the ordination council, which is the final affirmation of the local church. Young man comes to the pastor and says, I feel like I'm being called into the ministry, and the pastor begins to work with them and develop them, and ultimately it leads to the ordination council. It's built, first of all, upon ministry faithfulness. I don't think you and I ought to be ordaining 8-year-old kids. We ought not be ordaining 16-year-old kids. We probably ought not be ordaining 18-year-old kids. At least it ought to be rare. Because we need to see that there's a pattern of ministry faithfulness in their lives. We need to see them, as we've mentored them and coached them along, we need to see them begin to develop as a leader. And we need to see the faithfulness in their ministry as they begin to grow in a direction of being a pastor or deacon. So there's ministry faithfulness that has to be in view. Then we have to demonstrate God's call. Not why is it that you feel like God's called you into the ministry. And then let them tell us why they think God called them into the ministry. And give evidence of that in our lives, of that journey of how God's worked in their lives, that He brought them to themselves through salvation, that gave them a hunger for the Word of God. He never thought of himself as a preacher, but now God's beginning to open in his mind that maybe the next step is for him to be a pastor leader in a local church. So he demonstrates that call. The affirmation of the church itself that says, yeah, this young man came up in our church, we saw his passion for the Lord from the beginning, or he rebelled against the Lord, but he came back powerfully, prepared to enter into the ministry, made a fresh commitment of his life, and things are radically different right now. Whatever it is that the church can affirm that God is at work in their lives. Should be mentored underneath a pastor for a time. It should be at this point where a pastor in the church, for a pastoral leader, he ought to be involved in the process of walking alongside the pastor. This is where I failed really badly is in my early years as pastor. I didn't have, this never was played out for me in the way that it's been presented to me later in life. But if God had brought alongside of me a more active pastor, when God ultimately called me to himself to serve as a pastor, I would have had a lot of experience to be able to work on. But I didn't, because I hadn't been mentored by a pastor. Now the African American church does this amazing. In the African American church, before you can become a pastor, you have to become what they call a minister. And all that means is that your pastor has begun to introduce you to the ministry, and he sends you on hospital visits. He takes you on conflict resolution experiences. He takes you to this, and he takes you to that. He lets you preach once in a while. He does all these things that are helping prepare you for ministry. And so, mentoring underneath the pastor. Ultimately, the affirmation of the church is the step that is critical toward ordaining an individual. Number 6, the church requests an ordination council to examine the candidate's salvation experience, character, and call. Now, we are Baptists. The local church is the one that gives this. This council helps the local church. This ought never to be done just by a local church. At least not in our small churches. Because we call upon each other to be able to bring in gifted people, gifted men who have been ordained, to examine the candidate and make a recommendation back to the church. And then the church makes the final decision. But it's here where a pastor is examined, a young person is examined and says, so what do you believe about salvation? What do you believe about discipleship? What do you believe about the Bible? What do you believe about the Lord Jesus Christ? Where we have an opportunity with men that have devoted their lives to the Word of God to examine a young man and see if they are walking orthodox with the Word of God itself. But ultimately the church makes that final decision. The decision to be able to ordain an individual in the leadership. This is kind of the most focused development process that the church goes through, because you're recognizing a person as pastor who, according to Scripture, is one of the key leaders in the local church. And we're going to look at some of the definitions of how that plays out and try to clarify that here. Number 27 of 95. But the last part of the last presentation we can whip through pretty quickly if we need to. So we're now talking about, we've talked about biblical leadership itself. Now we're going to talk exclusively about the qualifications for biblical leadership. And as I mentioned, the two key passages that we can look to that give us the most information is 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. Now, both of these passages are primarily speaking of pastors, but in those same places you also find the qualifications of deacons as well. Now, I would challenge you to think not just pastors and deacons when we look at these qualifications, although that's what we're giving them explicitly for, but also think about other leadership positions within the church, because these qualifications are preeminently important at every level of the church. And you'll notice that almost exclusively, all of this is about character. None of this says you got to have a PhD in finance. None of this says you have to have a seminary preaching degree. All of this is about the personal qualifications, the character qualifications for leadership in the church. So don't miss that. Character is more important than anything that we can be taught in the classroom. It is preeminently important. And so when we look at these things, these are the focal point of what it means to be a leader in the church. Somebody want to read this for us out loud so that I can kind of save my voice back a little bit?
I can read it.
Thank you.
This saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, he desires a noble work. An overseer, therefore, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, self-controlled, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not greedy. He must manage his own household competently and have his children under control with all dignity. If anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of God's church? He must not be a new convert. He might become conceited and incur the same condemnation as the devil. Furthermore, he must have a good reputation among others, so that he does not fall into disgrace and the devil's trap.
Strong words, aren't they? Let's go ahead and read the second passage, then we'll go look a little bit at some of these individual pieces. Somebody else like to read Titus 1 for us? The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. As an overseer of God's household, he must be blameless, not arrogant, not hot-tempered, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, not greedy for money, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding to the faithful message as taught, so that he will be able both to encourage with sound teaching and to refute those who contradict it. Lots of stuff here. If we took time to unpack all of this, we would literally be out of time. So let me just kind of put the two pieces together for you, and you can kind of see the similarities and you can see the differences as well. This is Paul. First of all, I have to point this out to you. Paul is writing to Timothy. Who is Timothy again? He's the person that he's developing as a leader. And so he's telling Timothy what he needs to do. So just like you as a leader are helping that next generation, this is what Paul's doing for us in both of these passages. In Titus, who is Paul talking to? This is easy. Titus. And who is Titus? He's another one of the leaders that Paul is developing. And so what we see here is not just these lists of qualifications, but we see Paul doing leadership development here with his two key leaders. And so in both of these situations, he's writing to Timothy and he tells him what they need to be looking at when they appoint elders. Now notice also, the Christian Standard Version that we just looked at, the first passage was addressed to overseers. Remember that? And this one, the Titus passage, was addressed to elders. Now don't get caught up in that because it's the same people. We're going to look at that in a minute. But pastors, elders, and overseers are all the same people. So in one context, Paul calls them overseers. In one context, he calls them elders. And in another context, Paul in Acts uses all three terms, and Peter uses all three terms. And so we're talking about pastors in both of these settings. And these are the things that he says that they need to consider. They need to be above reproach, and he mentions that in both places, which means that as people look at their lives, there needs to be nothing blatantly outrageous in their lives that would call into question their message. And so they need to be above reproach. The husband of one wife, the faithfulness of the marriage relationship. Now, and I realize that when you and I look back into the Old Testament, people get confused. In fact, our culture is going to be here real soon. You know, now we've got men marrying men and women marrying women, which is not biblical marriage in any way, shape, or form. The next stage is, and you're going to see this coming because it's already percolating, is why can't I have 3 wives? Or why can't I have 2 husbands? Now, I realize in your cultural background, that was already a part of what it was in your early culture. In many parts of the world, that's accepted. That is not biblical marriage. And in the culture, in the New Testament, it's interesting that when we looked at the Old Testament, how many wives did Solomon have? Anybody remember? 300, I think, is what I remember. And 600 concubines, I think is what it says. So he had 900 women in his life. And he was supposed to be the wisest man in the world? Well, at the theological level, you have to look at the end of Solomon's life, and he tanked. I mean, he completely destroyed himself, and he destroyed the nation of Israel ultimately. And part of it was the unfaithfulness that he had. The biblical model is still one man and one woman for life. Now, an individual that comes to Christ who's already married to two people, that is a short-term problem. And I wouldn't say to an individual in that situation, you've got to put one wife away that's coming out of a cultural background. But certainly you'd never add another wife to it at all, and you would never condone that in your church for an individual that would want to do that. Because the scriptural teaching is one man, one woman for life. So husband of one wife, and mind you, that in that day and time in the Roman world, that was even true in the Roman world. You go back a couple hundred years before that was not true. But by the time you reach the New Testament, even the Jews themselves had reverted away from polygamy, again back to the biblical model of one man, one woman for life.
How do we tie this with, we may have divorce. Is that tied to being, from one wife or the
The divorce situation is less clear. In fact, when you'll have Christians, biblical Christians, from both perspectives on that would say that a person can be divorced. The phrase here, Paul does not use the Greek word for divorce here. He uses the word literally one woman kind of man. And so some people will leave that open to the fact that because he didn't use the word divorce and he defined it the way he did, that if a man has been long-term faithful to one woman, even if he had a divorce early on in his life or whatever, that he would still be qualified. Other biblical Christians would say, no, I think that's a failure in the person's character even before that. Some individuals would say, okay, then maybe if he became a believer after the divorce, would he be able now to serve? So there's valid positions on all three of those. And in the past, it was very clear in most Baptist churches, you would never have a divorced pastor. Today, it's a little bit more common. It was probably more common 20 years ago than it is today. And I see that in part because I think within most of our Baptist churches, divorce has become more rare in the last 20 years than it was 30 years ago. So those are kind of the three positions that are taken. All of them can make biblical arguments. I'm not going to tell you which one you ought to take.
depend on the local church.
If that's a local church decision. It's a local church decision. But again, I would examine the character of the individual overall, because we're talking not so much about just individual pieces, but the totality as well. Did you have a question too? Okay. Yes.
Basically the same thing.
All right. Good.
We can talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people are confused and they just want to hold on to what they have done wrong in the past, where they're failures, but I don't believe Jesus holds our failure against us when we are serving God. So I said, if we could have you as a leader teaching today, just kind of touch on that, and the more that we hear about it, we may have to start thinking about what would Jesus think about that, and not what do you prefer as a person? Is that your preference, or is that what Jesus wants?
That's why I say, biblically speaking, I think you can make a case for all three of those positions. And so usually that's left up to the local church. Now, we don't have time to go beyond that, but I would say that if you don't choose one of those three positions, you're not in a biblical position. So one of those three needs to be the explanation. And like anything that's controversial in the church, I think it needs to be taught clearly by the pastor why we're taking that position, so the congregation understands it. And you can have disagreement within the same congregation. I'm not saying that, but it needs to be taught clearly, because otherwise it's going to lead to conflict. And so you need to clearly teach why you think this is a biblical position, whichever of the three you take. Again, it comes down to what does the Bible say, and in this case, I think there is a little bit of difference of opinion at that point. Sober-minded, self-controlled, and those terminologies are similar in wording. We're talking about somebody that's not, not given to wide fluctuations, but is very controlled in the way that they think through things, is not the first one to throw off his hands and panic, but is self-controlled and sober-minded. Respectable, hospitable, is the pastor of a church one that reaches out to people and draws them in, hospitable. Able to teach. Now we're going to look at this a little while later. This is one of the major differences between a pastor and a deacon. The calling of a pastor, overseer, elder, whichever term you want to use, is a person that is able to teach. And so right here in the qualifications, in fact this is kind of interesting because all of this is pretty well character-based except for that one point, able to teach. Is that person able to take the Word of God and explain the Word of God? Because it's all about the Word of God. It is not what Pastor Leo thinks. It is what does God's Word say. And so the qualification here is for a person that's able to teach. Not a drunkard. It doesn't say that you cannot drink at all, which has typically been the old Baptist perspective. But the Bible speaks against drunkenness completely and totally. Now, many people choose to abstain completely because of the danger of drunkenness. And I'm one of those individuals. Because over the years, I've had a lot of alcoholics in the church. And I don't want to be a stumbling block for them, and so I choose abstinence. I don't insist that that's the only biblical position. The biblical position is no drunkenness at all. And so that is the hard line that we have in the text. Not violent, but gentle. Not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, like we talked about here earlier in between. One who manages his household well. His children are believers and not open to charges of debauchery or insubordination. Now, what is the word of children? What are children? I think children are the ones that are still in our home. There's delineations in the Greek language. We're not talking about grown adults who have rebelled against the Lord, but we're talking about a pastor's children in the church. This gets kind of touchy, doesn't it? Because the older kids are going to go through a period of rebellion, most of them. And so does the pastor have to resign because his older kids are in rebellion? I don't think so. I think that's an over-interpretation of this passage of Scripture. What it is teaching here is that he needs to be involved in his children's lives and imparting the gospel to them and trying to do everything that he can to be able to help his wife develop kids that are willing to follow after the Lord. And I think that's what we're talking about here. Not a recent convert. We were talking about this a little earlier as well. This is why you don't ordain a 16-year-old. Because a 16-year-old can only know what a 16-year-old is. Now, mind you, do you understand what I'm saying? If you're older than this, here's my personal experience. At 16, I knew what I knew at 16. Now, this has been an ongoing experience in my life. At 26, I look back and thought, wow, I didn't really get it. At 36, I look back and say, wow, I didn't have a clue. At 46, I look back and said, man, is this going to go on until I die? And at 56, I think, okay, man, Lord, the lesson is you just can't know some things until you've lived long enough and have gone through the experiences. So I don't fault a 16-year-old for what they don't know. They can't know it at that age. They're going to probably experience exactly the same thing that I've experienced. About every 10 years, I have a new epiphany. And I realized, wow, I thought I knew it all. I didn't have a clue. And it's still going on. All the way probably till death. I'm certain of that now. And so ordaining somebody too young before they really know who they are and have really committed themselves as an adult to Christ may be a very dangerous thing. Now, letting a kid preach at 16 in a youth service, go for it. Under the supervision of a pastor that can help them prepare and understand. Helping them along that process is what we're talking about. But ordaining them and saying to the world that this guy's ready to be a pastor at 16, probably not. You know, I remember at 28 when I actually pastored my first church. I'd been involved in church work all my life. I had served as an intern while I was in seminary as well. But at 28 as the pastor of the church. I remember thinking, I do not feel like I'm prepared for what I have to do here. Looking back at it, I was scared of that then, but I think that's the right attitude now, when I look back. So, not a recent convert. Well thought of by outsiders, is probably above reproach again. Not arrogant, not quick-tempered, a lover of good, upright, holy, and disciplined are all the full package of the characteristics that we have there. Any questions about what any of that looks like beyond what we've talked about? When we have an ordination council, we oftentimes at that point figure that all of this is already in place. And the reason why we do that is because the church has recommended to us that individual. And so typically at an ordination council, we assume this because you are the ones that asked us to come and examine his theology. We assume you've already done this. Because you watched the person mature and become a fully devoted follower of Christ. You watched them begin to serve. And so we assume that these things are done. That is really the most critical basis. If a ministry fails down the line somewhere, it's not usually because of other things, it's usually because of these things. It's just my experience with it. Well, I tell, in fact, I did an ordination service a month ago, and I said, an old preacher, D.L. Lowry was his name, he was a Texas preacher. His son served in Milwaukee in one of our churches for years. And David used to say, this is what his dad told him when he felt called into ministry. He said, son, stay away from the gold, stay away from the girls, and stay away from the glory. He summarized that being an overall summary of the kind of character. Now, this one, you understand. This one, you understand. But this one is probably the biggest one, really right here. Who gets the glory for anything that we as a leader do? Better be God. But the greatest temptation of ministry, I think, is when you and I begin to think, boy, didn't I do a good job? I'm really good at this. And we start to take on what should be God's alone upon ourselves. Some pretty good advice here when it comes down to it. And a person that has the foundation of character is better prepared to resist that last temptation. He'll resist the others as well, and that's a part of the qualifications. But he's better prepared to resist that last temptation with the greatest. You know, we had Bill Hybels. Any of you heard of Bill Hybels? You know, he was the mega church preacher that failed here a few years back because of inappropriate relationships with women. Here he is, he's 65, 68 years old at this stage of life. He's been gifted in extraordinary ways. He's influenced people all over the entire world. And what he gave into were at least these two pieces right here ultimately that led to the demise of his ministry. And it's not, you know what? The worst of it is not the demise of his ministry, although that's the way he saw it, his ministry. The worst of it is he brought shame to Christ. Because all over the world, then, the message of Christ becomes vulnerable because the person that was called to God didn't live out with consistency in their own lives. Here are just, we're not going to spend time on much of this, but look at these lists. These are you could go with a lot of stuff, but these are a lot of the things that can tank a ministry. You know, pride and arrogance is probably one of the biggest. Having a poor self-image is also one of those images. Our image needs to come in Christ. Not that we have a positive image of ourselves or we have a poor image of ourselves. Our image needs to come from Christ. Insecurity, people-pleasing, compromise, rigidity, hunger for affirmation, trying to impress people, making the church about us rather than about Jesus, appearance management, where we want people to think of us more highly than is reality, need to be needed, anger, bitterness, fighting the wrong battles, insensitivity, the list goes on, paranoia, fear, competition with others, spiritual facades, messiah complex, insistence of control, resistance to accountability, judgmentalism, abuse of authority, lack of keeping confidences, discouragement, the depression that can come with that, impatience, demonizing your opposition, unsanctified ambition, dishonesty, plagiarism, embellishment of our illustrations, telling a great story like it happened to us, personalizing others' illustration and calling them our own, misrepresenting the truth to avoid admitting our mistakes, to bolster our position, to make us appear better than we are. There's a lot of ways you can fail. But how does that happen? Through the cracks in our character, where we bring shame on Christ. So I think it's very interesting that Paul would put all of his qualifications for ministry are about character for those that are in leadership. A lot of things you can be taught to do, but if your character is compromised, it's a much more serious thing to change this than to turn it around. They just go on. Ways that we can fail in ministry as a result. So that brings us to the third section, leadership roles themselves, and talking particularly about scriptural officers of pastors and deacons. Because I think we really need to revisit this. I think there's some confusion in our churches today. I think there's confusion among churches today when it comes to these roles themselves. And so let's look back into the scriptures and see what the scriptures tell us. The qualifications of pastors are basically given to us in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. That's what we've already gone through. Here's my point. I'm convinced that we know the qualifications of a pastor, but we don't really know what the Bible tells us he's supposed to do. And in fact, the problem's bigger than that. Because if your church has 50 adults in it, there are 50 people that think they know what the pastor's supposed to do. And it's impossible for any one person to live up to the expectations of 50 different people. Especially if they don't understand what the pastor is supposed to do. So how do we deal with this? We've got to go back to the Bible. The Bible has to be the point of defining what a pastor is supposed to do. Because otherwise we just have 50 opinions. And that will destroy a pastor and it will destroy a church as well. McIntosh and Edmondson, and the dark side of leadership that we were talking about, that McIntosh is the person that wrote that book. He says that these factors are things that make the pastor a little bit different from almost any other occupation. He says, first of all, the presence of never being quite off duty. The pastor's life, he never knows where he's going to get the phone call and his whole evening changes. He never knows when one of you gets diagnosed with XYZ, and most pastors, we suffer with our people when we find out that they're up against something like cancer or a surgery. We suffer with that, or when a family calls him and their daughter has been killed in an accident, or any of those things. All of that carries in on a pastor, but the part of it is the unique pressure of never being quite off duty. The pressure of being in crisis mode for long periods of time. Because you have a crisis this afternoon, you have a crisis tonight, and tomorrow morning she has a crisis. And he shares them all. So he's caught up in that constantly in the pressure of the crisis for long periods of time. The pressure of being responsible for more than one control. Pastor, how come we're not running 150 in our church? It's your fault. If you preached better, if you visited more people, we'd be running 150. Is that what the Bible says the pastor's role is? And yet we put that off on the pastor almost always. There's an unwritten rule underneath the surface there. If he was really living up to it, we'd be doing better than what we are as a church. The pressure of an inadequate measure of success. So we baptized 10 people this year. Why didn't we baptize 20, Pastor? How do we know when we've done enough to be able to accept and sit back and relax in a minute? The relentless nitpicking, complaining, positioning, and bickering of church members is that final one. He didn't, in his book, he didn't add this one. I had him for a doctoral class, and he said if he had written the book later on, he would have added this. Because most pastors and pastors' families understand the pressure that comes with that. Just the constant nipping and criticizing that comes too often in the church. You see, the U.S. Army is organized, is it not? We started off with an illustration of that. And at the top of the organization chart, you have generals. See that? At the bottom down here, you have staff sergeants, and underneath that, which is not even on their chart, you got a bunch of corporals and privates. Those are the guys that get out of boot camp if they're lucky enough to get their stripe, and they're at the bottom of the rung. In the U.S. Army, the private doesn't tell the four-star general what to do, does he? But in the church, do I have to say it? In the church, the private thinks that he has the right, and always exerts the right, to tell the three-star general what to do. You see, one of the problems in the church, and Paul begs for this later on, he talks about, please honor your pastors, respect their authority. In fact, he says, over you, which sounds a little bit like this, doesn't it? But we as Baptists don't like that over you part. So we kind of cut that little phrase. We take an X-Acto knife and take that phrase out and cut it, throw it in the trash, because that's not one we want. But that's what the Bible says. Over you in the Lord. There's a clarity of organization in the U.S. Army. We don't have that clarity of organization in most of our churches. Now, I'm not saying to you, in fact, Paul doesn't say to you that your pastors have ultimate authority. They can be questioned by, remember, 2 or 3 witnesses to bring an accusation against the pastor. And he warns pastors not to lord it over their people. So there are controls on this as well. But in general, the clarity is in the Army, but it's not in the church. Now, this organizational chart, you'll remember this from the book of Exodus. Who was the person that God used to bring the people out of Egypt? Moses. Remember the problem? Moses was trying to answer all the questions for the people. The line was going on forever. People were frustrated. They weren't getting the answers they needed. Moses was worn out. His father-in-law, we don't like to be corrected by our father-in-laws, do we? His father-in-law says, I love this verse. What you're doing is not good, Moses. Not good, Moses. And he describes for him a system to set it right. And so the first organizational chart in the Bible is Moses, where he begins to organize the church, organize the people of God in the wilderness. They're not even yet Israel, really, in that sense. He organizes the children of Israel so that the work can be done that the people need done within that society. The same thing needs to happen in our churches, which we should be organized for. But the problem is we're confused about who's in charge. Because in a Baptist church, who's in charge? You might not want to answer this question, because it's a trick question. In a Baptist church, we say the people are in charge. We have a congregational meeting. We vote on something. 31 say this, 30 say that, so we do 31. That's the wrong answer. Who's in charge of the church? Jesus is. And Jesus called out leaders in the church, did he not? And so there are leaders in the church that God has called to organize the church. And yes, ultimately the congregation will make those final decisions. But they ought to be paying attention to the leaders that they recognize that God gave them as well. And so it's a process in which God calls leaders to lead the congregation, and the congregation to hold the ultimate authority of making those critical decisions for the direction of the church, where all of us are involved. But in many churches, the pastor really is not given the opportunity to lead the people. And as a result, 50 people meet on Sunday, and they have 50 opinions, and they take votes, and we don't go anywhere or do anything because we don't have the clarity of call that comes with following a leader. A God-called leader who has been tested according to his qualifications, has been examined to his call, and that the church has affirmed they're calling him as their pastor. Are you following me at this point? Why would we do that? Why would we say God has called this man to lead us and to preach to us and to teach us, and then when we come to actually living out the church, we act like he's not really even there? It's not a biblical model, as we're going to see here as we work our way through it. The church should be organized, and the Bible has made that clear to us and has shown us what this looks like. Now, first of all, we need to know the role of the pastor. And this is most clearly given to us in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. The words that are here in yellow, elders, shepherd, and overseeing, he's talking to the same group of people here. And so all three of these words are to the same group of people. They are describing the same group of people. And so these are not really titles. They are there to help us understand what the person is supposed to do. Again, this is the problem. Most of our churches know the qualifications of a pastor, but they don't know what he's supposed to do. Peter shares with us what this looks like. He says, therefore, as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of the Messiah. Now, wait a minute. I thought Peter was an apostle. Isn't he? Yeah, we don't have time to really describe this. Are there any apostles today? No, they all died. And so by the time Peter is writing the letter of 1 Peter, the transition is already in place. They realize these apostles that walked and talked with Jesus are probably going to be dead pretty soon. So what does leadership look like in the generation after they die? And we begin to see this transition by talking about elders, shepherds, and overseers being that position that replaces the apostles. So Peter defines himself not as an apostle here at this point, but as an elder. Witness to the sufferings of the Messiah, also participant in the glory about to be revealed, I exhort the elders among you, shepherd God's flock among you, not overseen out of compulsion, but freely, according to God's will, not for money, but eagerly, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. For the sake of time, I've got to really move here. What I want you to walk away from and understand clearly about these passages of Scripture is that these three things that are addressed here in this passage of Scripture tell us what it is that a pastor is supposed to do. The first one is presbyteros, which is the word elder. And there's a whole denomination in the United States that's based upon that term. Does anybody know what it is? Presbyteros. Presbyterian. And they take their leadership structure, they have elders in their leadership structure. They call their pastors elders. Now, poimen, which is the word shepherd, as we see here in this passage, is the word that most of us as Baptists use. Pastor. Pastor. And so it doesn't bring itself completely over into English, but we understand we call ourselves pastors, in America particularly. In some circles, they use the word episkopos, which is an overseer. There's a whole other denomination that uses that term. Anybody figure it out? Episcopalian. And Roman Catholics also use this form of government. And so when we look at these three terms, all three of these terms describe the same group of people. The elders, who are good leaders, should be considered worthy of ample honorarium, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. So according to that verse that Paul wrote, what does an elder do? He leads. You see that? He leads, and he preaches, and he teaches. And so we can look at that, and we can summarize that term tells us that one of the things a pastor does, he preaches and teaches, and he leads the congregation. Don't miss that. Now, the second term really stands for chaplain kind of work. To pastor somebody, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. And so one of the roles of the pastor is to help take care of the people of God. The chaplain, the people of God. And the final one, overseer, is, I define this off as he becomes a manager. My bottle of water got in the way there. He becomes a manager of the church. Episkopos, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you're willing, eager to serve, not lording over those entrusted to you, but being examples. See, the control is, if the guy is going to oversee the church, the development of the people, and oversee the affairs of the church, the danger is he's going to lord it over people. And so the role itself is a managerial role. So what is it, biblically speaking, that a pastor is supposed to do? Say it with me. He's supposed to lead, chaplain, and manage. That's what the Bible says a pastor is supposed to do. In most of our churches, do we let our pastors do those things? I'm not hearing much. Because we know it's not true. We typically don't. Now, I'm going to show you in a minute that no human being can do all those things. Very few people are gifted to be able to do all of that. But when you look at the biblical role of a pastor, these are the things that the Bible says that individual is supposed to be able to do. He's to be a leader. We see 110 times in 124 verses in the Old Testament, many different words for leadership. If you go through an English Bible and you look up in the back in the concordance and you say, you do a search for a leader, or you go out online and do this, you're not going to find all these terms. But in the Hebrew language, there were 26 different terms that describe a leader in the Old Testament. That's fascinating, because every one of these terms had just a little bit of a different take on it. You see wisdom and administration. You see to go on a journey, to be a king, to rule, to lead, to guide, to command or order, to be an elder, a leader, or a dignitary among the people. You see all these facets of what leadership looks like in the Old Testament. And that imagery is brought over into the New Testament. Key leaders in the Old Testament as offices were the prophets, the priests, the kings, the judges, and the elders. So by the time we get to the New Testament, and Peter and Paul are talking about pastoral leaders in the church, he uses the term elders to describe what it is that the pastor is to do. And so in some sense, what Paul has done is he's taken the Old Testament concept of elders as leaders in the synagogue, and he's brought it over into the church, that the elders are to be the leaders of the church. Pretty clear, pretty easy transition for us to see. So it doesn't just appear out of nowhere that Paul starts doing this. It's grounded in the Old Testament understanding of who the leaders are in the church. The Old Testament, when it speaks of elders, first of all, we see them the first time in Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, where are the people of God? They are still in Egypt. And so going all the way back before they really even become a nation, the elders of the people are still operating in the Old Testament. We see it develop even further. 70 of them eat a meal at the presence of God at Mount Sinai in the 40 years, that they're wandering around in Egypt. We see them included in Joshua's list when they're getting ready to go into the land. The people are divided up by what? By the elders of the people, the leaders of the people. We see the elders of Israel validating King David's leadership in 1 Kings. We see them support the construction of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings. And we hear them, or we see them throughout the Old Testament, hearing cases at the city gate,